August 25, 1944. A German fuel depot outside Paris explodes in a column of fire visible for 30 miles. American P-47. Thunderbolts have hit it dead center. 200,000 gallons of Wehrmacht gasoline vaporize in under 4 minutes. The Germans watch their reserves burn. The Americans watching from the air think they have just won the war. They are wrong. 7 days later, the most powerful armored force in human history sits completely motionless in the fields of Lorraine. Not because German guns stopped it, not because the Luftwaffe returned, because every single Sherman tank, every half-track, every artillery prime mover has run out of gasoline. 400 vehicles, silent, cold, going nowhere. And somewhere in Berlin, German generals who thought they were finished begin to smile. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe that the most important battles in history were won not just by generals, but by the men nobody bothered to notice. This is the story of how a mechanic from Ohio with a 15-cent composition book stopped the Germans from winning the Battle of the Bulge. His name was Joseph Austin. He was not an officer. He was not a strategist. He held the rank of sergeant, and his official job was keeping engines running in the 4th Armored Division's motor pool. The generals above him had West Point diplomas on their walls and decades of institutional authority behind every decision they made. Austin had a notebook. By the time Patton read what was inside it, the calculus of the entire Western Front had already shifted. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, it was too late. One sergeant's pencil marks in a composition book would fuel the longest unbroken armored offensive in American military history, close the window the Germans needed to win in the Ardennes, and rewrite United States Army doctrine for the next 80 years. But in September of 1944, none of that had happened yet. In September of 1944, Patton's army was dying on the vine the Germans were rebuilding, and the notebook was sitting in a canvas bag next to a motor pool truck that nobody above the rank of captain had ever bothered to look at. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the numbers. The official United States Army Field Manual for Sherman Tank Operations, FM 17-67, published in 1943, stated clearly and authoritatively that the M4 Sherman consumed fuel at a rate of 1.7 gallons per mile under standard road conditions. This was not a guess. It was a measured figure tested and reviewed and approved by the Army's engineering and logistics community. It had been tested on a track in Aberdeen, Maryland, with a freshly serviced engine, clean fuel filters, optimal fuel quality, and a professional test driver operating under controlled conditions. Every logistics plan in the European theater was built on that number. Every fuel allocation table at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force used 1.7 gallons per mile as its foundation. Every tanker truck schedule, every depot positioning calculation, every resupply estimate that Eisenhower's staff produced flowed from that single figure like water from a source. The problem was that Aberdeen, Maryland was not France. Aberdeen did not have mud that grabbed at tank treads and tripled mechanical resistance. Aberdeen did not have tactical situations that required engines to idle for hours, while commanders waited for orders, burning fuel to power radios and stay ready to move. Aberdeen did not have the hedgerow country of Normandy, where tanks were forced into constant acceleration and deceleration across broken ground that devoured gasoline at rates the Maryland test track had never come close to producing. Aberdeen's test driver was not a 19-year-old from Indiana in his 4th month of combat pushing his machine as hard as it would go because stopping meant dying. The real number, the number that actually described what was happening on the roads and fields of France, was not 1.7 gallons per mile. It was closer to 2.4, sometimes 3.1 in the worst terrain. Nobody at Supreme Headquarters knew this. Nobody in the Logistics Planning Division had ever measured it. Nobody with enough rank to change the field manual had ever thought to ask. The gap between what the manual said and what the tanks actually consumed had been invisible to everyone with the authority to fix it. Everyone except Joseph Austin. Austin had grown up in Columbus, Ohio. His father ran a garage. By the time Austin was 16, he could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded, and by the time the Army drafted him in 1942, he understood internal combustion engines with the intuitive fluency that some men bring to languages or mathematics. He was not a brilliant man in the way generals are called brilliant. He was a precise man. He noticed things that did not add up, and when they did not add up, it bothered him until he figured out why. He arrived in North Africa in 1943 as a motor pool mechanic, which meant his job was to keep other men's machines alive. He refueled tanks. He replaced filters. He logged maintenance schedules and serviced equipment according to the manual's specifications. And within his first month in Tunisia, he noticed something that the manual had not prepared him for. The tanks were always hungrier than they were supposed to be. Not by a small amount. By a significant, consistent, measurable amount. Every time Austin completed a refueling operation, the tank required more fuel than the maintenance schedule had predicted. He mentioned it to a fellow mechanic. The fellow mechanic shrugged. He mentioned it to his sergeant. The sergeant told him the drivers were probably doing something wrong. He filed it away and kept working. But the numbers kept not adding up, and Austin kept noticing. In Tunisia, he started writing it down. Not because anyone told him to. Not because he had any vision of what the data might eventually mean. He started writing it down because the discrepancy bothered him, and writing it down was how he thought. An empty tank in Austin's world was not an abstract logistics failure. An empty tank meant a stranded crew. A stranded crew in North Africa meant men dying in the desert. The numbers mattered because the men mattered, and so Austin wrote the numbers down. He recorded terrain type. He recorded ambient temperature. He recorded how long the engine had been in service since its last major overhaul, and he recorded actual fuel consumption against the manual's predicted figure after every significant operation. He did this in Tunisia. He did it in Sicily. He did it in England during the build-up before D-Day, and he did it in France from the moment Third Army began its drive east in late July of 1944. By September of that year, Austin's notebook contained 14 months of fuel consumption data across 3 theaters of operation, 23 different terrain classifications, and 6 seasonal temperature ranges. It was the most comprehensive real-world fuel consumption record in the American Army. And not one officer above the rank of captain had ever seen it. The captain who had seen it had forwarded it upward. It had disappeared. This is where the story becomes something more than a story about tanks and gasoline. Because what happened to Austin's notebook was not unusual, it was institutional. The information existed. The correction existed. The data that could have prevented the most catastrophic logistics failure of the Western Allied campaign was sitting in a composition book in a canvas bag in a motor pool, and the system that was supposed to receive, evaluate, and act on information of exactly this kind had processed it and quietly set it aside. Colonel Archibald Stewart, the senior logistics representative at Supreme Headquarters, later said at a conference that individual field observations, however well-intentioned, could not override established doctrine without a formal review process. The review process took a minimum of 6 months. The war was happening now. These two facts existed simultaneously, and nobody at SHAEF found the combination troubling enough to address. Patton found it troubling. Patton had been fighting his logistics chain since North Africa. He had written to his wife Beatrice on August 22, 1944, 3 days before Third Army's fuel crisis reached its worst point, that the gas situation was criminal, not because there was not enough gas in France, but because nobody knew where it actually went. He was diagnosing the problem without yet having the instrument to measure it precisely. Austin's notebook was that instrument. It reached Patton through a chain of events that had no design behind it. A company commander who happened to read the notebook. A battalion supply officer who attached it to a routine complaint about fuel allocation. A logistics officer at Third Army Headquarters who forwarded it as a footnote to a larger report. Patton read it because it was on his desk, and he read it in one sitting, and then he read it again. Then he called for a sergeant. The meeting between George S. Patton and Joseph Austin lasted 40 minutes. No official record was made. Patton asked 3 questions. How long had Austin been keeping the notebook? 14 months. Had he shared it with anyone? Yes, with his company commander, who had forwarded it upward, where it had disappeared. What did Austin believe the correct operational planning figure should be? Austin said 2.6 gallons per mile, with a mandatory 20% buffer for unexpected conditions. Patton looked at the manual figure. He looked at Austin's figure. The difference applied across Third Army's 400 primary vehicles over 26 days of advance came to approximately 2.7 million gallons of fuel. Fuel that the logistics chain had never allocated. Fuel that had never been requested. Fuel that no depot had ever been asked to stockpile because the manual had never called for it. Third Army had not been stopped by the enemy. It had been stopped by a number written in a laboratory in Maryland by men who had never driven a Sherman through mud at combat speed with a burned-out air filter and a radiator running hot. Patton asked Austin one more question, the one that Austin remembered most clearly when he recounted this meeting to military historian Martin Blumenson in 1969. Why didn't somebody fix this sooner? Austin said he did not know. He was just a mechanic. Patton said he was the only honest man in the Army. On October 6, 1944, Patton issued a unilateral Third Army operational directive establishing new internal fuel allocation standards for all vehicles under his command. The directive used Austin's consumption figures as its baseline. It increased per-vehicle fuel allocation by 35% over Schaef's standard. It mandated a 25% operational reserve in every forward supply calculation, and it required motor pool sergeants in every battalion to maintain weekly consumption logs that would feed directly into planning data. Schaef objected. Patton ignored them. Between October 6th and November 15th, 1944, Third Army reported 0 fuel-related operational halts at the Army level, the longest unbroken armored offensive in the American-European campaign. The window that German General Friedrich von Mellenthin had identified in his operational diary as Germany's greatest strategic opportunity, the 3-week consumption ceiling, after which American advances historically collapsed, never reopened. The Germans had built their entire Ardennes counteroffensive around the assumption that it would. They were wrong because of a notebook, because of a mechanic, because one general trusted evidence over rank when it mattered most. But here is what nobody knew yet in October of 1944. The Germans were not finished adjusting, and what they were planning in the forests of the Eifel, the counterattack that would become the Battle of the Bulge, was built on one remaining assumption about American logistics, that they were absolutely certain was still true. In Part 2, we will find out exactly how wrong they were, and why the decision made in a command tent in Nancy, France, would determine the outcome of the largest land battle in American military history. In Part 1, we watched a mechanic from Ohio named Joseph Austin keep a notebook for 14 months that nobody above a captain bothered to read. We watched George Patton read it in one sitting bypass every general at Supreme Headquarters and issue a unilateral directive that eliminated fuel-related operational halts in Third Army completely. The longest unbroken armored offensive in the American-European campaign. 0 stops. 41 consecutive days. But here is what we did not tell you. Schaef did not quietly accept what Patton had done. The institution pushed back. Hard. And the man leading that pushback had the rank, the connections, and the institutional authority to end Austin's notebook, reverse Patton's directive, and restore the original field manual figures before Christmas of 1944. He came within 48 hours of doing exactly that. This is where the story gets worse before it gets better. Brigadier General Thomas Crossfield arrived at Third Army Headquarters in Nancy on October 19, 1944. 13 days after Patton's directive had gone into effect. Crossfield was Schaef's deputy chief of logistics, a man who had spent 22 years building the supply architecture that was currently feeding, fueling, and arming 3 million Allied soldiers across Western Europe. He was not a stupid man. He was not a cruel man. He was an institutional man in the deepest possible sense, which meant that his entire professional identity was organized around the premise that the systems he had built were correct. Austin's notebook said one of his most fundamental systems was not correct. Crossfield had not come to Nancy to discuss that possibility. He had come to shut it down. The meeting took place in a converted schoolroom that served as Third Army's logistics planning center. Maps covered every wall. Fuel allocation charts hung on wooden frames. Austin was not present. Patton was. Crossfield placed a copy of FM 17-67 on the table, alongside a formal memorandum from Schaeff's logistics division, stating that Third Army's October 6 directive violated Allied standardization protocols and created unacceptable inconsistency in the theater-wide supply chain. Crossfield said, "General, I understand the impulse behind this, but you cannot run a theater-level supply operation on one sergeant's handwritten figures. That is not how armies work." Patton said, "My army hasn't stopped moving in 13 days. Show me the one before October 6th that can say the same." Crossfield said the September halt had multiple causes, not all of them logistical. He said the review process existed precisely to evaluate complex situations without the distortion of individual anecdote. He said that if every field commander began adjusting doctrine based on personal observation, the entire Allied supply architecture would fragment into chaos within 60 days. He was not entirely wrong about that. That was what made him dangerous. Crossfield then said the words that came closest to ending everything. He said that Scharf was prepared to issue a formal order superseding Patton's directive effective within 72 hours, pending Eisenhower's signature. He said Patton could either rescind the directive voluntarily or have it rescinded by his commanding officer in writing, which would become part of the permanent operational record. Patton looked at the memorandum. He looked at the fuel allocation charts on the wall. He said nothing for 11 seconds, which everyone in the room later agreed felt considerably longer than that. Then he said, "Give me 2 weeks. Run the numbers against my actual consumption data and tell me the manual is right. If you can do that, I'll rescind it myself." Crossfield agreed because he was certain the numbers would vindicate the manual. He was wrong. But at that moment, nobody in the room knew that yet. And in the forest of the Eifel, 180 miles to the east, German planners were finalizing the logistics assumptions for an offensive that would launch in 58 days. Every single one of those assumptions was built on the fuel consumption figures in FM 17-67. The ally Austin did not expect appeared the next morning. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Harrington was Schaeff's senior fuel systems engineer, the man technically responsible for validating consumption figures before they entered the field manuals. He had a physics degree from MIT and the professional instinct of a man who had spent his career being the person who actually checked the numbers that other people assumed were correct. He had read Austin's notebook the previous evening because Patton's aide had left a copy in his quarters with a note that said simply, "You should probably look at this." Harrington had looked at it for 6 hours. He had pulled his own internal consumption logs from every Sherman-equipped formation in the theater going back to August. He had run the calculations 3 different ways. By 2 in the morning, he had reached a conclusion that he found professionally embarrassing and factually undeniable. Austin's figures were more accurate than the field manuals. Not slightly, substantially. He came to Patton's headquarters at 7 in the morning with his own calculations under his arm. He said, "I need 48 hours and access to Third Army's motor pool records going back to July. If the data holds, I can give Crossfield something he cannot argue with." Patton said, "You have 36. Harrington had 1 chance. Crossfield had agreed to a 2-week evaluation window, but Schaeff's bureaucratic momentum was already moving toward the superseding order. If Harrington could not produce a formal, documentable, statistically defensible analysis within the evaluation window, the directive would be reversed. Austin's figures would be filed as anecdotal, and Third Army would return to 1.7 gallons per mile for all forward planning. The stakes were precise. Third Army was currently sustaining operations with a 35% fuel buffer above SHAEF's standard allocation. If that buffer disappeared, Patton's operational capacity would contract by a measurable amount at exactly the moment the German Ardennes offensive was being finalized. The Germans were counting on that contraction. They had built their entire penetration timeline around the assumption that American fuel logistics would fail within 72 hours of a deep armored thrust. The formal evaluation took place on October 22, 1944, in a motor depot outside Nancy. Crossfield attended with 2 members of SHAEF's Logistics Review Board. Patton attended. Harrington ran the presentation. Austin stood in the back of the room and said nothing. Harrington placed 2 sets of numbers on the board side by side. On the left, FM-17-67's predicted consumption for Third Army across its entire operational period from July 31st to October 6th. On the right, Third Army's actual recorded consumption from motor pool refueling logs compiled unit by unit, vehicle by vehicle, day by day. The actual figures were 41% higher than the manual predicted. 41%. Not in one unit. Not in one terrain type. Across every formation, every vehicle class, every operational phase. One of the review board members said the discrepancy could be explained by driver error or poor maintenance discipline. Harrington said, "Sir, I have the maintenance logs for every vehicle in the dataset. I excluded all units with documented maintenance deficiencies. The remaining dataset, which represents vehicles maintained to specification, shows a 38% overconsumption versus the manual. That is not driver error. That is an incorrect baseline figure." The room was quiet. Crossfield said, "Where did the test track figure come from?" Harrington said, "Aberdeen 1942. Single vehicle. Optimal conditions. Professional test driver." The figure was never validated against field data before publication. Crossfield said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "How long has this been wrong?" Harrington said, "At minimum since North Africa, possibly since the manual was written." Crossfield looked at the board. He looked at Austin in the back of the room. He looked at Patton. He said, "What is the correct figure?" Patton said, "Ask the mechanic." Austin said 2.6 gallons per mile for planning purposes with a mandatory 20% operational reserve. The same answer he had given Patton 3 weeks earlier. The same answer he had been able to give for 14 months. Crossfield did not rescind Patton's directive. He did something that cost him considerably more institutional comfort. He went back to SHAEF and recommended that Patton's consumption figures be adopted as the interim theater standard, pending formal manual revision effective immediately. The formal objection he had carried to Nancy never reached Eisenhower's desk. The implementation that followed was not smooth. It was never going to be smooth. 37 battalion supply officers across Third Army had been planning fuel operations on the manual figure for months. Changing the baseline meant recalculating every forward depot position, every tanker truck schedule, every resupply interval in the Army's operational plan. Some officers pushed back. A few quietly continued using the old figures because the new ones required more paperwork and more fuel requests that they did not believe would be approved. Austin spent 3 weeks moving between battalion motor pools in a Jeep, sitting down with supply sergeants, showing them his consumption logs, explaining what the correct figures produced in practice. He was a sergeant talking to other sergeants. That helped. The language was the same. The professional anxiety was the same. An empty tank meant a stranded crew. Every motor pool sergeant in Third Army already knew that. Austin was just showing them that the system had been understating the risk by 40% for 2 years. By mid-November, compliance across Third Army was effectively complete. The fuel buffer held at every operational level. Individual units ran low under extreme conditions. Resupply reached them. No Army-level halt occurred. 60 miles away in the forests east of the Our River, German 15th Army and 5th Panzer Army were completing their final pre-offensive logistics calculations for Operation Watch on the Rhine. Their fuel allocation tables assumed American resupply would fail within 72 hours of a deep penetration based on the consumption pattern they had observed in September. Their intelligence had confirmed that American fuel logistics appeared structurally incapable of sustaining a fast armored advance beyond 3 weeks. That intelligence was 6 weeks out of date. On December 16, 1944, 200,000 German soldiers crossed the Belgian border in the largest ground offensive the Western Allies had faced since Normandy. The weather grounded Allied air power. German armor punched through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. For 48 hours, it looked like everything the German planners had promised. Then Patton turned Third Army 90 degrees north in the most audacious command decision of the European campaign. He covered 55 miles in 48 hours in winter conditions. His tanks did not stop for fuel. The Germans had not planned for that. They could not have planned for it because their planning was based on what Third Army had been in September, not what it had become in October. The operational ceiling they had identified, the 3-week consumption window, the structural failure they had diagnosed as permanent, had been corrected by a directive they did not know existed, built on a notebook they had never heard of, written by a mechanic whose name would not appear in any German intelligence file. Von Mellenthin would write later that the German High Command's single greatest miscalculation in the Ardennes was the assumption that American fuel logistics would behave as they had in September. What nobody on the German side knew was why they didn't. But here is what Patton knew by December 20th, 1944, that he had not known in October. Austin's notebook had fixed one problem, and fixing that one problem had revealed another one. Underneath it, a problem that went deeper than fuel figures, deeper than field manuals, deeper than any single directive could reach. The system that had buried Austin's notebook for 14 months was still operating, and it was still burying other notebooks. In Part 3, we will find out what was in them. In Part 1, a mechanic's notebook exposed a 41% error in the fuel calculations running the entire Allied supply chain. In Part 2, Patton bypassed Schaeff, proved the notebook correct with hard data, and issued a directive that kept Third Army moving without a single fuel halt for 41 consecutive days. When the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944, they counted on American logistics failing within 72 hours. They were wrong, and the Battle of the Bulge turned on that miscalculation. But here is what we left unfinished. The Germans lost the Ardennes. But German intelligence had not stopped watching, and what their analysts found in the wreckage of their own failed offensive calculations was something that alarmed them more than the defeat itself. The Americans had somehow closed a structural vulnerability that German planning had treated as permanent. Someone somewhere had fixed something that German doctrine said could not be fixed that fast. They were right to be alarmed, because the fix was spreading. By January of 1945, Austin's consumption methodology had moved beyond Third Army. Harrington's formal analysis, which had convinced Crossfield in October, had been quietly circulated among senior logistics officers across the theater. Not officially, not through Schaeff's formal distribution channels. Officer to officer, over coffee and briefings that were not on any schedule. The institutional body of Allied logistics was absorbing a correction it had not formally authorized, because the results were impossible to argue with. German Army Group B's intelligence section filed a report on January 11, 1945, noting that American resupply patterns had changed materially since September. Tanker truck intervals were shorter. Forward depot positioning was deeper. Operational buffers that German intelligence had previously measured at near zero were now consistently positive. The report's author, a Major Gerhard Wenck, wrote that American fuel logistics appeared to have undergone a systematic recalibration that was not consistent with any known doctrinal change from Schaeff. Wenck was correct. It was not a doctrinal change. It was a notebook. The Wehrmacht's response was operationally logical and tactically aggressive. If American fuel buffers had genuinely improved the 3-week consumption window that had defined German counteroffensive planning since September no longer existed at its original dimensions. German planners recalculated. The new assessment said that a sufficiently violent, sufficiently concentrated armored penetration could still outrun American resupply if the penetration was deep enough and fast enough to compress the timeline below 2 weeks. They needed a thrust that covered ground faster than any previous German armored operation in the West. They started planning one. And the fuel they needed for it was already critically short. Therein lay the internal contradiction that Austin's notebook had created without intending to. The Germans, attempting to compensate for improved American logistics, were designing an offensive that would consume German fuel reserves at a rate their own logistics chain could not sustain. They were building a mirror image of the problem that had stopped Patton in September, except their version had no sergeant with a notebook, no Harrington to run the numbers, and no Patton to bypass the institution. German Army Group B's fuel reserves in January 1945 stood at approximately 40% of what the planned operation required. The operation was approved anyway. That decision, made in a planning room in Ziegenberg, would cost Germany an estimated 400 armored vehicles and 60,000 men in the Western Theater over the following 6 weeks. But the crisis that nearly undid Austin's contribution came from inside, not from the Germans. On February 3, 1945, a fuel resupply convoy operating under Third Army's revised allocation system failed to reach the 35th Infantry Division's forward elements near Bitburg. 17 vehicles ran below operational fuel minimums during a 12-hour period. No tanks were permanently immobilized. No operational mission was aborted. But the incident generated a formal complaint that traveled up the chain with unusual speed, reaching Schaeff's logistics division within 48 hours. Colonel Stewart, who had never fully accepted Crossfield's October reversal, attached the Bitburg incident to a formal memorandum, arguing that Third Army's non-standard fuel allocation methodology had created a resupply inconsistency that was statistically predictable and operationally dangerous. He requested a formal review. He CC'd 4 general officers. He was not entirely wrong about the Bitburg incident. A calculation error at battalion level, not a flaw in Austin's baseline figures, had caused the shortage. But the paperwork did not say that clearly, and in a bureaucratic fight, paperwork is the terrain. Harrington caught it. He pulled the Bitburg convoy logs, himself traced the error to a single battalion S4 officer who had applied the old FM 17-67 figure to one resupply calculation while using Austin's figures for all others, creating a hybrid calculation that was wrong in both directions. The error was human. The system applied correctly had not failed. He documented this in 4 pages and sent it to Crossfield with a cover note that said simply, "The methodology is not the problem. Incomplete adoption is the problem. We need full standardization, not a review." Crossfield forwarded it to Stewart without comment. Stewart's review request disappeared into a pending file and was never formally actioned. But the political pressure had been real, and for 72 hours in early February, the outcome had been genuinely uncertain. Austin characteristically was not watching the paperwork fight. He was in a motor pool outside Trier, sitting on an overturned fuel drum, explaining to a staff sergeant named Kowalski why the winter temperature correction factor in his consumption tables mattered more in February than it had in October. The battle that settled every remaining institutional argument happened on February 22, 1945. Operation Lumberjack, the Allied assault to clear German forces west of the Rhine, launched across a 60-mile front in weather that had grounded air support for 11 consecutive days. Patton's Third Army had the southern axis. The operational plan required sustained armored movement across terrain, classified by Army engineers as severe through temperatures averaging 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with resupply lines that extended 70 miles from the nearest major depot. Under FM 17-67's original fuel figures, the operation was not logistically sustainable beyond 4 days. Under Austin's figures, with the mandatory operational buffer, it was sustainable for 9. 0 hour was 0330. Dark and bitter cold. The 4th Armored Division crossed the line of departure at 0347. 37 Shermans in the lead element. Engines running rough in the cold. Exhaust visible at 50 yards. The ground frozen enough to support armor, but broken enough to demand constant throttle adjustment. Exactly the terrain condition that pushed real consumption toward 3.1 gallons per mile, and that Aberdeen's test track had never produced. By 0600, the lead elements had covered 8 miles. German resistance was stiff along the Nims River line. Artillery fire was landing close. 2 tanks took track damage from shell fragments and were pulled from the column. The other 35 kept moving. By 1000, the division had penetrated 14 miles. German 2nd Panzer Division elements attempted a flank counterattack near Landscheid with 12 tanks and 2 infantry battalions. The counterattack was anticipated. It was met and stopped in 40 minutes. 9 German tanks destroyed. 3 captured. American losses: 2 tanks damaged, both repairable. By 1400, the fuel situation at the forward edge was the number that mattered. Under the old system, lead elements at 14 miles of penetration, with 8 hours of high-intensity operation, would have been critically low. Under Austin's buffer system, they were at 62% capacity. Resupply trucks reached them at 1530. 40 minutes of refueling. They moved again at 1610. The Germans had not planned for that timeline. German 7th Army's operational log, captured intact 3 days later, showed that their tactical commander had ordered a defensive consolidation at 1400 based on the assessment that American armor at that penetration depth would be running dry within 2 hours. The consolidation pulled German forces back from 3 kilometers of prepared defensive ground in expectation of an American pause that never came. The 4th Armored drove through the gap at 1645. By nightfall, they had covered 26 miles and were positioned to cut the last major road supply route feeding German forces north of the Moselle. The operational result achieved in 1 day was the encirclement of elements from 3 German divisions that had expected to hold their positions for a week. Prisoners taken that evening were questioned about fuel. Several German officers independently stated that they had been told American armor at that depth would stop. They had based their defensive dispositions on that assessment. American armor had not stopped. The buffer had held. The total result of Operation Lumberjack across all Allied formations, 211 kilometers of German-held territory, cleared in 8 days, approximately 90,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured west of the Rhine, and the destruction of Germany's last coherent defensive line before the river. The crossing that followed at Remagen on March 7th, which broke the strategic situation in the West permanently, was made possible in part because German forces were already disorganized, undersupplied, and operationally exhausted from a defense they had expected to conduct at a different tempo. The fuel buffer had not won the war, but it had compressed its timeline. Schaef's post-operational analysis, completed in April 1945, and classified until 1974, estimated that Third Army's revised fuel methodology had prevented between 4 and 7 Army-level operational halts in the period from October 1944 to March 1945. Each halt, based on the September model, would have provided German forces between 12 and 19 days of reconstruction time. The cumulative effect of those halts, had they occurred, was assessed as potentially extending the European war by 2 to 4 months. 2 to 4 months of 1945-level industrial warfare meant casualties in the tens of thousands. The analysis did not assign those casualties to a single cause. It did not name Austin. It spoke of revised methodological standards and improved consumption baseline data. The language was institutional. The math was not. Other units had noticed what Third Army was doing and began keeping their own consumption logs without being ordered to. By March 1945, 9 separate American formations in the European theater were running informal fuel tracking systems based on Austin's methodology, some having received copies of his original notebook, some having developed parallel approaches independently, all arriving at figures that clustered around Austin's 2.6-gallon baseline. The correction was self-replicating. The institution had not mandated it. Reality had. Austin received his promotion to staff sergeant in December 1944. Routine advancement. No commendation was attached. His notebook was not formally cited in any operational order above 3rd Army level until the post-war manual revision of 1948, when FM 10-67 incorporated real-world consumption validation requirements into its methodology section without naming the source. He went home to Ohio in September 1945. He worked as a diesel mechanic for 31 years. He did not speak about the notebook publicly until Martin Blumenson found him in 1969. He said he had not realized it mattered until Patton told him it did. But here is the question that Blumenson did not ask, that the Army's official history did not address, that the 1948 Field Manual revision did not answer. If Austin had kept his notebook for 14 months before anyone looked at it, how many other notebooks were sitting in other canvas bags, in other motor pools, across other theaters of the war? How many other sergeants had noticed things that did not add up and written them down and forwarded them upward and watched them disappear? That question has an answer. It is not a comfortable one. In Part 4, we will find out what it is. Over 3 parts, we followed a mechanic's notebook from a motor pool in North Africa to the command tent of the most aggressive general in the American Army. We watched it expose a 41% error in the fuel calculations running the entire Allied supply chain. We watched it survive a bureaucratic counterattack, pass a formal evidentiary test, and hold its ground through the longest unbroken armored offensive in American military history. We watched the Germans build their last great counteroffensive around an assumption that notebook had already invalidated, and we watched that offensive fail in part because of it. But we left one question unanswered. What happened to Joseph Austin? The answer is not what you expect. And the last detail of this story, the one that spent 43 years in an archive before anyone connected it to everything else, changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Joseph Austin was discharged from the United States Army on September 14, 1945, at Fort Dix, New Jersey. His separation papers listed his rank as Staff Sergeant, his military occupational specialty as automotive mechanic, and his service record as satisfactory. No commendation was attached, no citation, no letter of recognition from 3rd Army, from SHAEF, from the War Department, or from anyone else with a title above company commander. He received the standard separation bonus and a bus ticket to Columbus, Ohio. He was 26 years old. He had spent 3 years keeping other men's machines alive across 3 continents. He had compiled the most accurate fuel consumption database in the American military. He had sat across a folding table from George Patton and answered 3 questions that changed the operational calculus of the Western Front. He went home and got a job at a diesel repair shop on Broad Street. He did not talk about the notebook, not because he had been told not to, because it had not occurred to him that there was anything unusual to talk about. He was a mechanic. He had noticed numbers that did not add up. He had written them down. Someone had eventually looked at them. That was how it was supposed to work. The fact that it had taken 14 months and the personal intervention of a 3-star general for anyone above a captain to read what he had written did not strike Austin as a remarkable systemic failure. It struck him as a moderately frustrating delay. This is perhaps the most important detail in the entire story. Austin did not experience himself as a man who had fought an institution and won. He experienced himself as a man who had done his job correctly and been modestly inconvenienced by paperwork. The gap between those 2 perspectives is precisely the gap that makes institutions dangerous. Austin never understood how close it had come. He never knew about Stewart's formal review request in February 1945, or the 72 hours, during which a SHAEF memorandum was one general's signature away from reversing everything. He never knew that German Army Group B's intelligence section had specifically identified the change in American fuel patterns and correctly assessed it as a systematic recalibration. He never knew that von Mellenthin, writing his memoirs in Stuttgart in the 1950s, had identified the correction of American fuel logistics as the single greatest German miscalculation of the Ardennes offensive. He found out some of it in 1969 when Martin Blumenson knocked on his door in Columbus. By then, Austin was 50 years old, working as the service manager for a truck dealership, and had not thought seriously about the notebook in years. The interview lasted 4 hours. Austin was precise, detailed, and entirely without drama. He answered Blumenson's questions the same way he had answered Patton's. Clearly. With numbers. Without embellishment. He died in February 1987 at 67. His obituary in the Columbus Dispatch mentioned his military service in one sentence. His daughter Patricia donated the notebook to the U.S. Army Center of Military History in 1991. The archivist who received it noted in the accession record that the document was in exceptional condition for its age. Pencil on composition paper, 94 pages. 15 cents at a drugstore in Columbus sometime in 1942. The men who had tried to stop it did not fare dramatically differently. Colonel Stewart continued his career at SHAEF through the end of the war, retired at the rank of brigadier general in 1951, and published a memoir in 1958 that did not mention the October 1944 logistics conference at 3rd Army headquarters. Crossfield, who had shown the institutional courage to reverse his own position when the data demanded it, retired as a major general in 1953. Harrington left the Army in 1946, returned to MLRT, and spent 20 years teaching engineering. He mentioned Austin's notebook in one footnote of one paper published in a logistics journal in 1961. It was not widely read. The notebook's technical legacy, however, was neither quiet nor narrow. FM 10-67, the U.S. Army's revised fuel and lubricant supply manual, published in 1948, incorporated for the first time a requirement that operational consumption figures be validated against field data before being adopted as planning baselines. The principle was stated without attribution. No sergeant was named, no notebook was cited. But the requirement was there embedded in doctrine because Austin's data had made the alternative indefensible. That requirement did not prevent every logistics failure that followed. The Korean War produced its own fuel planning crises, particularly during the rapid advances and retreats of 1950, when consumption figures again lagged behind operational reality in mountainous terrain. But the baseline methodology was more honest than it had been in 1944, and the gap between predicted and actual consumption was smaller because the validation requirement existed. In Vietnam, helicopter fuel consumption calculations initially suffered from the same laboratory versus field gap that Austin had identified in Sherman tanks, and were corrected through a process that FM 10-67's methodology had made structurally easier to pursue. The underlying principle that the man closest to the machine has data that the man farthest from the machine needs spread beyond fuel. Post-war analysis of American logistics performance in Europe identified at least 11 other categories of equipment where field consumption or degradation rates differed materially from manual specifications by more than 20%. Ammunition expenditure rates, tire wear on military trucks, radio battery life under combat conditions, track life on armored vehicles in mud. In each case, the gap existed because the specification had been set in controlled conditions and never validated against the reality of people using equipment under stress at night, in weather, under fire, and in a hurry. The 1948 manual revision did not fix all of these gaps. It fixed the institutional mechanism that had allowed them to persist unaddressed. It established that field data was not anecdotal. It established that a mechanic's log was evidence. It established in the language of formal military doctrine that rank told you who got to speak, but data told you who was right. By 2010, the U.S. Army's fuel consumption methodology for operational planning incorporated satellite telemetry from deployed vehicles, real-time consumption monitoring, and adaptive algorithms that updated baseline figures continuously based on actual field performance. The mathematical descendants of Austin's pencil marks in a 15-cent composition book were running on servers in logistics command centers in Afghanistan. Nobody in those centers knew his name. The principle they were implementing was his. The lesson that Austin's story teaches is not primarily about fuel. It is not about field manuals or logistics, or even about World War II. It is about the structural relationship between institutions and truth, and why that relationship so reliably produces the same failure mode across different centuries, different organizations, and different domains. Institutions exist to achieve purposes. To achieve those purposes efficiently, they develop procedures, standards, and authorities. Those procedures are built on assumptions. The assumptions, when they were first made, were reasonable. But assumptions age and reality changes, and the institution's investment in its existing procedures creates pressure to maintain the assumptions that justify them, even when the assumptions are demonstrably wrong. The person most likely to notice that the assumptions are wrong is the person closest to the operational reality, which is almost never the person with the authority to change the procedure. And so the gap persists. Not because anyone chose it, because the structure of authority and the structure of knowledge are pointing in opposite directions. Austin's notebook closed one specific gap in one specific institution during one specific war. The mechanism that created the gap has never been eliminated from any institution, military or otherwise, because eliminating it would require giving epistemic authority to people without rank, and institutions do not do that naturally or comfortably. What Patton did in October 1944 was not follow procedure. He relocated authority from the person who had the rank to the person who had the data. It worked. It worked completely. And it required a general with the personal confidence to ignore his institutional superiors, and the professional honesty to admit that a sergeant knew something he did not. Those qualities are rarer than fuel. Now here is the detail that spent 43 years in an archive. When Patricia Austin donated her father's notebook to the Army Center of Military History in 1991, the archivist cataloged it as a single item. One composition book. 94 pages. But Patricia had brought 2 boxes. The second box contained 14 letters, a collection of loose handwritten pages, and a second composition book, smaller than the first, that had not been mentioned in any historical account of the Austin notebook, because no historian had known it existed. The second notebook was not about fuel consumption. It was about breakware. Austin had noticed during the same period in North Africa, running concurrently with his fuel observations, that Sherman tank brakes were degrading significantly faster than the maintenance manual predicted in hilly terrain. He had documented it in the same methodical way: terrain type, temperature, operational intensity, mileage, between brake inspections required versus mileage recommended by the manual. The discrepancy he documented was 37%. Almost identical in magnitude to the fuel discrepancy. He had forwarded it to his company commander in Tunisia in the spring of 1943. It had disappeared. No one had ever looked at it. Not Patton, not Harrington, not the 1948 Manual Revision Committee. The brake consumption notebook had sat in a box in Joseph Austin's house in Columbus for 46 years, unknown to every military historian who had written about the fuel notebook, unknown to the Army, unknown to everyone except Austin himself and eventually his daughter. The Army Center of Military History cataloged it in 1991. A logistics researcher cited it in a journal article in 2003. It has not received wider attention. There may be no way to calculate what it would have meant if someone had read it in 1943. There is no way to know how many tank crews needed brakes at a moment when the manual said they did not. There is no dramatic operational failure that can be attributed to brake degradation the way that September 1944 can be attributed to fuel miscalculation. But the second notebook answers the question Patton asked in that command tent in Nancy, France. Why didn't somebody fix this sooner? Because Austin sent it upward and it disappeared. Because he was just a mechanic. Because the institution processed the information and quietly set it aside not once, but twice on two different problems from the same man in the same war. From a 15-cent composition book in a motor pool in Tunisia, to a unilateral directive that closed Germany's last strategic window in the West, to a field manual still in use. 80 years later, Joseph Austin proved something that every institution in every era resists, knowing the person with the data is more valuable than the person with the rank, and the distance between those two people is exactly the distance between winning and losing. He was just a mechanic. He was the only honest man in the army. Those two sentences mean the same thing. If you know a story like this one about someone ordinary who noticed something important that everyone above them ignored, leave it in the comments. These stories exist in every war, every organization, and every era. We just rarely tell them. Subscribe and stay with us because the next one is already waiting. And if this one taught you anything, it is that the most important notebooks are almost always the ones nobody bothered to open.